intensely grapple with the subject. Now, there are at least 5 or 6 definitions under which you will find references to construction. You have a construction of residential complex, you have commercial or industrial construction, and we also have a works contract where construction is predominant. But the first one to come was commercial and industrial construction. In 1994, we were all hesitant whether the idea to tax services would be welcomed at all, would be legally sustainable at all, because we are using the residual power given to us under the Constitution. Now, over a period of 18 years, a number of judgments have come which has upheld the levy of tax on the basis of positivist approach, on the basis of the definition of taxable services. Now, in the construction sector, if you look at it, repair comes in commercial construction, repair appears in residential construction, and there is also a separate service called repair and maintenance of service. It's hair splitting for an ordinary taxpayer. He has to find out where his repair will be classified to pay tax. He is paying tax willingly. His compliance should be appreciated. His effort to comply should be welcome. But on the contrary, he is made to hair split, where should I classify? This is the biggest issue which we have. So like this, if you look at it, there are a number of instances where the law is becoming complex over a period of time. One more complexity I can point out is the definition of commercial training and coaching service. So many amendments have come, and probably it is one of the services where you have maximum number of amendments. And at least if I am right, in the past 2-3 years, this service has been amended. Definition of this taxable service on commercial training and coaching has been consistently tinkered with. So whenever you tinker, something goes inside, we think we clarified, something goes outside. And in the process, you get certain amount of complexity. So like this, over a period of time, we have not been able to grapple with the kind of complexity involved in taxation of services. Now, every definition had inclusions, exclusions, overlaps between various definitions. All these things made our law very complicated. So, the Honorable Finance Minister recognized this when he said, complexity in service tax law is one of the first and foremost challenges before us, and we should tackle this by all means. So comes the new approach. What is the new approach? At the heart of the new approach, as you would see in the slide, is the definition of service. A set of 6 notifications have been issued to operationalize the negative list approach from the 1st of July 2012. So the old sections will go. We may have to forget all the 119 definitions of taxable services. Actually, we had close to about 400 definitions in section 65, and now it's all going to be reduced to about 55. Now, as a common parameter, as a common denominator for all these 119, we have one definition of taxable service. That's one definition of service. We are defining what is a service. This is the biggest challenge we have taken. With inputs from industry we have taken. We have consulted, for example, Chartered Accountants Association, Cost Accountants Association. All of them have organized seminar when the consultation papers were placed in the public domain. The suggestions given by them have been examined at every stage. And even if the finance bill was presented in the parliament, certain amendments were made in the definition of service, because when we got the comments from the industry and the business, we found that some of these things, some of these changes, some of these amendments are necessary. Now, definition of service is the basis of the new approach. In the place of 119 definition, I am going to have one definition. I will go into that definition in detail as I move along. And now, along with that, I have 4 other new ideas to support this definition of service. What are those 4 new ideas? I have a negative list. Everybody calls it negative list approach. But we prefer to call it a comprehensive approach, because it is opposed to an earlier approach of selective taxation. What I want to tax, I try to describe in words, and at times I lose as well. So the negative list is a comprehensive approach. It comes in section 66D, which is new, which will take into effect from 1st of July. And then I have declared services. That is available in section 66E. And then these two, if you look at it, I have placed the place rules on the top, that is in section 66C, and taxable territory in 66B. The definition comes in section 65B. Taxable territory is a territory where these sections would apply. This chapter would apply. Now, a service to be taxable should be in the taxable territory. That is why if you look at in the slide, the taxable territory as down below. The service should take place there. And how to determine whether a service is provided in the taxable territory, you have called what is called as place rules. It is very difficult to tax services. It's a challenge because they do not have a form or shape physically. So you need what are called as proxies, and place rules and time rules are the two supporting structures for the taxation of services. As you know, time rules have always come. Now it has become part and parcel of our taxation. There were issues raised by the people in time rules. That is the point of taxation rules. And now this year, we have introduced the place rules. The place of provision of services rules, 2012. Now these two rules together support the definition of service, and you have negative list and declared services list on either side. We will be able to tax services in a far more simpler manner, in a far more progressive manner, in a far more taxpayer-friendly manner. This is our expectation. Now I will move towards the concept of the negative list. The service is defined, as I told you earlier, as an activity for a consideration. Now, a transaction involving, voice should be increased. The taxable service, the service is defined as an activity for consideration. And it excludes what is called as image, an acronym, which stands for immovable property, money, actionable claim, goods, and employee. The acronym explains its image. And after this comes, there are three ideas: taxable territory, negative list, and the exemption. Okay, still it's an activity for consideration. If it is in the negative list, it is not taxable. If it happens in the taxable territory, it is taxable. And still you have an exemption list. So a taxpayer should check up with two lists, negative list and an exempt list. The exempt list is called as, or colloquially referred to as, mega exemption or jumbo exemption, whatever. A notification is already placed in the public domain. It is yet to come into operation. It is supposed to come into operation on the day on which section 66B, that is the new charging section, will come into effect. But after the budget, some changes have been requested from various sections. So therefore, probably some changes are expected in that notification. But still there will be what is called as an exempt list, or mega exemption list will be there. So a person has to check up two lists, whether his services, whether his activity for consideration is covered in the negative list or not, whether it is covered in the exemption list or not. If it is falls in these both these lists, then there is no service tax. Otherwise, tax is leviable, provided the service happens in a taxable territory. Now, the definition of service, let us deal with in detail, because it is the definition of service which is at the heart of this entire new approach. This definition has an inclusion, there's an exclusion, And there are explanations. The inclusion is the declared service. There is a separate section on declared service where there are about 9 entries which talks about certain services which are already taxed. This is to remove ambiguity whether after the negative list approach some of these services which are already taxed will be taxable or not. To remove that doubt, what is called as the concept of declared service has been introduced in the Finance Act. Now, after that, there is an exclusion. What are those exclusions? Where there is a transfer of title, there is an exclusion. It is an excluded from the definition of service. Then you have deemed sale. What is deemed sale of goods under Article 366 within bracket 29A? Now that will be excluded from the definition of service. And then money and actionable claim will be excluded from the service. And the relationship between employee and employer, you cannot take that as a service between the service, a relationship between service provider and service receiver for a consideration, therefore it is taxable. So therefore, the employer-employee relationship is excluded from the definition of service. And you have fee paid for the courts or tribunals, that is also under exclusions. So therefore, you have 5 exclusion, 1 inclusion, and there are explanations. There are 3 explanations. Functions attached to elected office. Now, the service rendered by a member of parliament, member of a legislative assembly, an elected member of a panchayat or municipal corporation, they are all elected officers. And the service which they provide in that capacity, it is not chargeable to service tax. Next one is duties attached to constitutional positions. Now, as we know, in a number of instances in the Constitution, you have various authorities performing duties which are assigned to them in the Constitution. They perform what is statutory duties. The Controller and Auditor General, for example, the Union Public Service Commission, for example. These are all constitutional bodies providing certain service. Now, duties attached to such constitutional positions, they are excluded from service tax. Once I call it a comprehensive approach to taxation of services, these explanations and exclusions are required so that the law becomes absolutely clear and simple. And then duties performed in government bodies. Now, this is the broad structure of the definition of service. If the definition of service can be comprehended, it is easy for an ordinary taxpayer to understand whether he is liable to pay service tax or not. Now, let me go into the definition of service. We said it's an activity for a consideration. Many people ask, why do you call it activity? Why don't you say it's an economic activity? Then what happens to other activities? You have a social activity. If some of you have gone through the guidance papers released by the TRU, it's a draft guidance paper, it is not yet final. And the final guidance paper will be published shortly before July 1st. We take charitable activities, for example. Certain type of charitable activities, certain class of charitable activities are going to become taxable hereafter beyond a certain limit prescribed. Certain services of the charitable activities are exempted, but certain activities are liable to service tax when they are above a threshold limit of about 25 lakhs, or when the charitable activities are giving services to a business entity. So these are all big changes coming. Now, when you say an economic activity, how do you say the activity of a charitable organization? Whether you call it economic activity or you call it social activity. Now the question comes, the definition of, if I use the word economic activity, it should not run into the same difficulties as we faced in the case of the meaning of the word commercial. A number of orders and judgments came which said that commercial means there is a profit motive. But TRU inserted an explanation proposed an explanation in the definition of the commercial training and coaching service as to what do we mean by commercial. It simply means there is an activity and there is a consideration, need not necessarily a profit motive. So, very thoughtfully, and to avoid the law from becoming very complex, the word activity has been used when we define the definition, when we define what is a service for the purpose of service tax. What is an activity? It's a direct and immediate link between activity and consideration is important. If there is no direct and immediate link, then there is a problem. Not to include any activity without any reciprocity. So an activity there should be a quid pro quo. If there is no quid pro quo, then you cannot consider it as an activity for consideration. So A pays, it can be in monetary terms or in non-monetary terms, or it can be in any other form. He pays and he takes a service. So very clearly, there is an activity, and this activity involves reciprocity. So if an activity does not involve reciprocity, for example, a donation, a gift, it does not involve reciprocity. Therefore, there is no tax on that. It will not come under the definition of service. So the word activity is very, very important. And the third is, we should keep it in mind when we define what is an activity, we should define taxes on consumption. It's a consumption tax, service tax. Therefore, what is savings or an investment will not be covered under this term, activity. Next, I'll go into the word consideration, because these are the key words when we define service. It's an activity for a consideration. Now, in the case of consideration, it is nothing but everything received or receivable in return for service. Everything received or receivable in return for service. We all know in the past we had definitions which said services to be provided or to be provided. So for the present and the future was covered. The same way, everything received or receivable in return for service. So which means even deferred payments will be taken as consideration. So everything received, monetary, non-monetary, or in any other form. So consideration is yet another important term which would explain us the definition of service. Now there are several aspects: accidental damages, demurrage, then money given from court settlements and subsidies. After the finance bill was placed in the parliament, we received questions, doubts on court settlements. What do we do if the court orders alimony to a person, compensation in the case of a divorce proceeding, maintenance in the case of a divorce proceeding? What happens? Is it taxable to service tax? Now, in the case of court settlements, if the court settlements are relating to a provision of service, then they are liable to service tax. If the court settlements are not relating to a provision of service, if it is relating to a maintenance or alimony or as a compensation in divorce proceeding, then it will not be liable to service tax. So court settlements are important. Then demurrage. For example, somebody wants to use the certain storage space. For example, container. The container is, instead of 48 hours are allowed. Before 48 hours, you have to take clearance of the container. But what happens is the person has to, for any reason, the examiner has not come or examination has not been done, and for any reason, he has to keep it for another 7 days. There is a kind of penal rate charged on that. Now, that will be also considered as a consideration for the service. So one cannot say that only the 48 hours is free and therefore there is no tax on that. The demurrage also becomes the part of the consideration. It is a consideration, and therefore service tax is leviable on the demurrage as well. And there are subsidies. There are different kinds of subsidies, and the subsidies which are in the nature of influencing the value of service, then it is liable to service tax, because that falls within the definition of consideration. Then we cover accidental damages. On accidental damages, you have very elaborate discussions in the guidance paper, draft guidance paper. Still there is time. People can go through. If you have any issues on the accidental damages, if there are any doubts or clarifications, please refer so that it can be explained and it can be clarified. Now I go to the explanations. There are explanations in the definition of service, as I said. There are explanations which is relating to what is called as distinct persons. When there are establishments located in a taxable territory and a non-taxable territory, they are to be treated as separate persons. A service provider is in one place and a service receiver is in another place. He is in a non-taxable territory and the person, another service provider is in the taxable territory. Then they are become distinct persons and the service between them provided for a consideration. The elements of taxability, if they are present, then they are liable to service tax. And similarly, members and unincorporated associations and bodies is a kind of a joint venture we are talking about, referring to. These have been already clarified. A judgment also had come on the subject. So members, they cannot claim that they are part of the joint venture. Once you are in a joint venture, the member can be independent as well. So independently, a member providing service to the joint venture, that will be liable to service tax. Now, in the definition of service, as I said, we are talking about not mere image. Immovable property, money, actionable claim, goods, and employer-employee relationship. These are the 5 aspects which make what is called as an acronym image. Immovable property, we take it as it is defined in the General Clauses Act. Money is defined. It is a legal tender. Consideration for conversion is taxable. Money's definition does not, it excludes when it is given as a consideration, when there is a consideration for conversion. For example, a charge is taken when you convert currency from one form to another, then it does not come within the definition of money. Therefore, a legal tender is excluded, but a foreign exchange transaction involving a consideration, that is a change in the form of currency, is liable to service tax. Then we have what is called as an actionable claim. Actionable claim is defined in Transfer of Property Act. Unsecured debt is an example of actionable claim. And the commonest actionable claim which we all know is a lottery. And these are which will be excluded from the definition of service. Then you have vouchers, coupons are excluded from the service. Then you have goods, Sale of Goods Act definition is adopted here, that in the case of deemed sale, to the extent of the value of goods, they are excluded. That means the service portion is liable to service tax. And in the case of employer and employee relationship, casual employees are considered as employees, but contractual employees are not. Service outside the terms of the employment are taxable, whereas overtime is not taxable. For example, a person may be teaching in a college, but he may be also doing a private tuitions outside. It's liable to service tax if he doesn't fall within the threshold limit. The threshold limit stands at 10 lakhs. A person taking a private coaching, rendering a private tuition, a service, a teacher or a professor, and he gets more than 10 lakhs in a year, then he is liable to pay. The aggregate value of the service provided in the previous year is more than 10 lakhs, and the current year it exceeds 10 lakhs, then he is liable to service tax. Then I come to the negative list of services. The negative list of services have been drawn taking into account the socio-economic requirements of our country, the federal nature of our polity, and the best international practices. Now, there broadly 17 categories are there in the negative list, and these are services which are listed in the negative list can be broadly put in 3 categories. Government, diplomacy, and economy. Number 2 is federal polity, And number 3 is society and development. As we all know, in the Constitution, there is no concurrent power of taxation. The powers of taxation is divided between the states and the center. So therefore, certain items of taxation which belong to the domain of the states have been kept in the negative list. Selling of space for advertisement, hoardings, selling of space in newspapers, print media, betting and gambling, admission to entertainment events. These are some of them which have been kept in the negative list. Then we look at the society and development orientation. What are those services which are kept? You have a whole lot of services relating to agriculture, agricultural produce, recognized education, preschool education, vocational education. All these are outside the tax net. Then mass transport is outside tax net. The specific word used there is stage carriage. Stage carriage means it is defined in the Motor Vehicles Act. The services are used and it is paid for from one stage to another. And there is a trip sheet available. If you go through the definitions, it will be very interesting. It is available in the Motor Vehicles Act.